Hello, my name is Dane Cohn, and this is A History Unrepaired, a study on the history of housing discrimination and how we can repair its legacy. Now, a lot of this research is based off various books, most heavily based off of the book The Color of Law by Richard Rothstein, which I highly recommend reading in various articles and interviews. And with that, let us begin. And we'll be beginning with a brief history. So, where we are going to start this is the New Deal. Now, the New Deal was started by FDR and the New Deal Coalition, and a lot of this were just policies to help curb the effects of the Great Depression. Now, one of the most severe effects of the Great Depression was housing. People across the country were homeless and couldn't find any housing. So the solution to this was the New Deal housing policy, so the National Housing Act of 1934. Now, the National Housing Act of 1934 had two aspects to it, which was the KPAR Act, which provided low-interest mortgage rates to potential home buyers, and the Better Housing Program, which aimed to make homes and mortgages more affordable. Now, these policies were actually great in that they did provide millions of Americans with the ability to buy housing and have quality housing and not be homeless. But these policies had major flaws, and mainly that too often African Americans were systematically excluded from these policies. You see, when public housing was created by these policies, often African Americans were excluded from these public housing projects, or the housing projects were segregated, and part of the public housing projects which housed African Americans were severely lower quality when it came to the construction quality of the housing, due to the fact that the federal government often would not insure loans to projects that included African Americans. And now we go on to and also the big part of this is redlining with the New Deal housing policy. You see, redlining was a practice done by the federal government, in which the federal government thought, oh well, if we're going to provide these low mortgage rates, or we're going to insure these mortgages, basically help out with mortgages, which was a big part of the National Housing Act, then we need to decide which areas are high risk, which areas are low risk. Now, the problem with this is that often they did this zoning not based off of risk, but instead based off of race. You see, with redlining, and this is an example of a redlining map, there were 4 different types of zones. Green zones were considered the best, and they would almost always get good mortgages and loans. Blue zones were considered still desirable for investment, and yellow zones were named as declining, and it was very hard for a yellow zone to get those mortgages or quality loans. And then red zones were deemed hazardous. Now, often red zones were they just straight up classified red zones as areas that were predominantly African American. And now, often when they were drawing these maps, they would not explicitly say that, but it is what they would do without using the language, due to the fact that it was actually illegal for them to explicitly use that language, so they would do it without using the language. And the yellow zones, which were marked as declining, were very much the same thing. They did not explicitly use the language, but they would use language that was pretty direct. They would, for yellow zones, they would say things such as, the area has been infiltrated by undesirable individuals, which is just sickening language and really shows the intent when drawing these maps. Now, to go on to the next slide, we have to ask the question, why? Why did the government do this? Well, a big part of this was because of Southern whites in Congress. You see, FDR himself actually did try to advance the economic position of African Americans, but he also had to allow a lot of these horrific policies inside of the housing acts because he had to appease the Southern Rights in Congress. See, the Southern Rights in Congress were a key part of the New Deal coalition, and without them, he could not get any of his agenda passed. So what ended up happening is Southern whites ended up having these things put in. For example, Southern whites would, in Congress, they would block amendments that said that public housing projects could not be segregated. Another thing they would do is that Southern Democrats and Southern white Democrats in Congress actually put in policies that said that Social Security, minimum wage protection, and recognition of labor unions, these three things that were key parts of the New Deal and really helped Americans accumulate capital, they made sure that all three of those things denied coverage to occupations which were predominantly occupied by African Americans in the South. These occupations being those such as agriculture and domestic service. And here we have a picture of a factory where African Americans are working, and this is an example. This is an example where a recognition of labor unions would be denied simply because of the policies of these Southern Rights Congress. Now, to go into specific, what was so detrimental about the National Housing Act, we have to go into the FHA. The FHA was a factor of the National Housing Act. It began in 1934, and it basically exercised a lot of practices, especially during the New Deal, but also going well into post-World War II, that denied these housing policies from African Americans. For example, the FHA would not insure loans to housing cooperative developments that included African Americans, which meant that and housing cooperatives really need loans to get off the ground. So this meant that housing cooperatives often just excluded African Americans just because they couldn't get a loan from the FHA because of that. And the FHA would also not insure loans for non-white developments in general. So it wasn't just housing cooperatives. It was any type of housing development, even private housing developments. The loans would not be insured by the FHA if they included African Americans, which is just absolutely sickening and had a detrimental effect in the future. And with this, we have a story here. So this is an example of something the FHA did post-World War II. This was in 1958. This story is out of the book The Color of Law, which again I highly recommend you read. And basically, in 1958, Gerald Cohn, he was a teacher who rented his house to a fellow teacher, and this fellow teacher was African American. Now, the FHA couldn't actually do anything about this. Gerald Cohn was completely in his right to be renting a room in his house, or to be renting his house out. But what the FHA did because of this is they actually forever denied Gerald Cohn benefits of participation in the FHA insurance program, and they said that he would never again be able to obtain a government-backed mortgage. Which, if you think about it, that practice is just horrific. They use these covert ways of preventing African Americans from finding housing anywhere by using these tactics where they couldn't actually prosecute people by law because law could not explicitly use this language, but they would use these tactics to do it anyway, such as the ones in this story. Now, to go to another three-letter organization, we go to the PWA. Now, the PWA, with a Public Works Association, was formed in 1933. And it was actually chaired by a man named Harold L. Ickes. And there he is there. The thing to know about Harold L. Ickes is that he was actually much more liberal when it came to racial matters than others in the effort. The majority of those in the effort actually were the majority of those in the effort very much did want to exclude African Americans from the public works projects, but Harold Ickes was actually, again, he was more liberal in this, and he actually worked to try to include African Americans in these projects. And as a result of his efforts, one third of the units from the projects actually ended up being occupied by African Americans. Now this is good, but the problem is that he still left the projects segregated by project or by building. Another problem with the PWA is that they ended up segregating projects in areas where segregation had previously been non-existent. Despite the neighborhood composition rules. See, the neighborhood composition rule, which itself is a violation of the Constitution, so the neighborhood composition rule was something that was negotiated by ICS, and it basically said that the neighborhood composition rule basically said that when creating this public housing, that it had to have the same racial composition as what had already existed in the neighborhood prior to the construction of the public housing. But the thing is that this wasn't followed. Almost every single time that this public housing was created, it was segregated. And as mentioned earlier, what would happen is the public housing made for African Americans was of lower construction quality due to the fact that they lacked to be able to obtain the same loans as the public housing created for white residents. And so what they ended up doing is that they would create this segregated public housing in integrated communities and create segregation where it did not exist before. And what would also happen is with this public housing, the government would actually create slums. See how they would do this is residents, a lot of African American residents would be occupying flats in these areas. And what would happen is the government would come in and they would displace the residents of these flats and create this public housing. Now the thing to know is that public housing was not meant to be a low income option for housing. It was meant to be an option for housing for those who could afford housing but couldn't find any housing because of housing shortages. So what would end up happening is African Americans would be displaced from these flats and they would have to move into these public housing projects where the rent was exponentially more than what they had been paying. And to be able to afford this severely increased rent, they would have to double up with other families to be able to afford the rent. And the result of this is that it severely increased population density, and the result of the increased population density is the creation of slums created by the government. And this happened all over the United States. This was not just the South. This happened in the Northeast. This happened in the Midwest, and it just continuously created segregation in previously integrated communities. Now, the PWA was disbanded in 1943, but the problem is that the USHA took its place and continued to racially segregate communities. Same thing the PWA was doing, where segregation was previously non-existent. Now in the presentation, we're going to be going post-World War II. Now, this is a very important area for understanding this history. We have an important quote here that is from the book The Color of Law, where it says, "Following World War II, the government was not following pre-existing racial patterns. It was imposing segregation where it hadn't or had not previously taken root." So, and then we just have a picture of World War II there. But to open up this era, I'm going to start with a story. The story of East Palo Alto. Now, Palo Alto is in California, and what happened? This, as you might have guessed, is post World War II, and this example is actually in the book The Color of Law. And what happened here is, once again, the federal and state government, through housing policy, intentionally created a slum. So one way they did this is there would be overpriced houses for desperate buyers. You see, East Palo Alto was the only part of Palo Alto where African Americans were allowed to buy housing, because they weren't allowed to buy housing anywhere else in the city. And because of this, they were desperate house buyers, and because of that, real estate agents would often jack up prices, and thus make the houses overwhelmingly expensive. Now, and also once they moved in, once they moved into this area, once again they were not able to obtain mortgages because the mortgages were not insured by the government, and thus the banks wouldn't give them out. And once this had been created, the city needed a new school because the population had increased so much. Now, a lot of city activists protested, and they said that, well, what needs to happen is that the city needs to draw an east and west boundary so that the city creates two integrated schools. But the city didn't do this. What the city did instead is that they created the second school right in the heart of East Palo Alto, which meant that everybody in East Palo Alto had to send their kids to the new school, and the old school, everybody outside of East Palo Alto sent their kids to, which created a segregated school system. And this was absolutely detrimental going into the future, since education is such an important factor of social mobility, which I will go into later. So, and it's also important to understand that the East Palo Alto was not just an exception. Governments did the same thing across the entire country, whether they be the federal government, whether it be state governments, whether it be municipal governments. These same policies happened all over the country. So we now continue to Eisenhower. Now, Eisenhower brought in a very dark age when it came to housing discrimination. You see, even though a lot of these policies happened under Roosevelt and Truman at least tried to take steps towards non-discrimination. For example, Truman's racial equity formula. Eisenhower undid all of these steps. He undid all of this. And Eisenhower even abolished a policy, even though this policy had never been enforced, that said that African Americans and whites should receive the same quality of public housing in the country. Again, this policy had never been enforced, but Eisenhower still abolished it. So we now continue to economic zoning. Economic zoning is an incredibly important factor in understanding this history. Economic zoning was often used with racial intent. You see, the Supreme Court case Buchanan v. Warley actually ruled that zoning could not explicitly be done based off of racial discrimination. But economic zoning was a loophole to this. Often economic zoning would be done off racial premises without using the explicit language. So, for example, city planners would intentionally designate certain areas as first residential, and they would do this in order to ensure that African American families wouldn't be able to afford housing in the areas, thus suppressing social mobility. And then, and this part's extremely despicable, city planners would actually change an area's designation from residential to commercial if African Americans began to move into the area. And this had drastic effects, especially later in the 20th century, because these designations of these zones as commercial made African Americans ineligible for FHA mortgages, because industrial development was seen as a risk to property value, and this made housing much more expensive for African Americans, and it suppressed social mobility. Now, what have been the results of this history? Well, first of all, there's been a huge environmental risk imposed on African American communities. See, in 1983, there was actually an analysis by the U.S. General Accounting Office, and it found that commercial waste treatment facilities and/or uncontrolled waste dumps were more likely to be found near African American than white residential areas. The Commission for Racial Justice of the United States Churches of Christ by Greenpeace, they also did a study on the same thing, and they found that race was so strong, a statistic of where hazardous waste facilities could be found, that there's only a 1 in 10,000 chance of the racial distribution of the sites occurring randomly. They also found that the percentage of minorities living near incinerators was 89% higher than the national median. That's the next part to understand here is that incomes are often replicated in the next generation. So that's how this has affected the world today. And one of the few things that grows generational wealth is property, especially in the United States. Property is something that, with a few historical exceptions, almost always increases in value and thus gains wealth for the next generation. And with this generational wealth, it's important to note, to just demonstrate this factor generational wealth in the United States, that according to Brookings, 42% of children born to parents in the bottom fifth of income distribution remain in the bottom. So because African Americans today, their grandparents were denied these New Deal policies, these mortgages, etc. They were denied these incomes. Incomes were suppressed. That has been carried on generation to generation, and they haven't been given opportunity for social mobility because housing is such a big factor of social mobility. And also another factor of this is densely populated areas, as created by the aforementioned policies earlier in the presentation, because these also limit social mobility. Densely populated areas are detrimental to social mobility. And another part of this is lack of opportunity for education due to the way that in which the U.S. Schooling system is funded. You see, we talked a lot about how schools were set up in East Palo Alto. This happened all over the country, where schools would intentionally be created so that only people in these government manufactured slums went to these schools. And what happens is, because schools in the United States are funded by property taxes in the given area, these schools are severely underfunded, and children that go to them are not given the same opportunities for education, and the same opportunities for education required for social mobility. It's also important to know that many racist policies still exist today. Banks often use the guise of reverse redlining to sell predatory loans in predominantly African American neighborhoods. And this is actually really bad. This was actually really bad before the 2008 financial crisis, because of just how many predatory loans there were and how often they would be targeted at African American communities. Now, there were more protections introduced after 2008, but these practices still happen today. So, what are some solutions? Well, one is education. See, we cannot fix the problem if a substantial amount of the population is ignorant to its existence. So we must teach this history and its repercussions in our school curricula. You see, in the United States, there's a huge problem right now where members of governments are trying to exclude teaching the history of the United States and racism in school curricula. And this has been labeled things like patriotic history. Now, this is dangerous because this means that people will not be aware of the existence of the history of how the United States has been racist and has pursued these racist policies. And that is not the direction we can go. That is not the direction we should go. What we must do instead is that we must make sure that these things are taught. We must make sure that people are aware of these problems, that people are aware of the effects of this legacy, so that people will stand up and try to repair the legacy. Now, another thing is zoning laws. A solution is to ban single-family zoning ordinances, also known as restricting zoning ordinances. This is actually what I talked about a lot in my interview with Liam Reynolds of the Colorado Springs Pro-Housing Partnership. Now, Colorado Springs has very restrictive zoning laws, and restrictive zoning laws means that in most residential zones, only single-family homes projects are allowed to be built, and this makes housing far too expensive and thus limits social mobility. So this is just one thing we could do to repair this legacy: just ban single-family zoning ordinances. This is something that the Colorado Springs Pro-Housing Partnership supports. And this is something that I personally support, and I think that would be a good solution. Now, another solution, which is proposed by the book The Color of Law, would be for the government to buy vacant homes and then sell them to African Americans at the price adjusted for inflation that their grandparents would have paid if they were permitted back then. And another solution is just reparations. This is something that the city of Evanston, Illinois, has begun doing, where people whose families have been economically hurt by these housing policies, they are eligible for reparations from the government. So this is the part where I thank you for watching. And I hope that this presentation has motivated you to action, as my research has motivated me to action. I hope you will continue your research with this, and that you will be motivated to, yet again, further look into this, write your representatives, and try to overturn the disastrous effects of this legacy. Thank you so much for watching and for learning with me. Goodbye.